I'll tell a story and I'll get to the point where a difficult decision is faced by a character, and I'll stop and say, what do you think the character will do? What do you think the character should do? We then break that down into a philosophical question. What is it to make a choice? Or what is it to be happy, whatever it might be? And we do philosophy like that. And then we come back to the story and say, okay, let's see if you agree with what the character does. So what I was doing was activating the classroom as moral agents rather than mere witnesses to a story. So that they start to inhabit the questions that the characters are standing inside, and they consider them philosophically before returning, and then they evaluate what the characters have done. And it's not a far step from that to doing philosophy.
Welcome to another episode of the Education Matters podcast. I'm your host, Jason Buccheri. One of the defining tensions of our age is that we have more information than any civilization in history, and yet fewer places where that information is examined slowly and thoughtfully. Knowledge moves instantly. Opinions form quickly. Algorithms reward speed and certainty. But genuine thinking, the kind that asks what something means, whether it's true, and how it should guide our lives, moves much more slowly, if at all. And this is where the study of philosophy should enter the picture. For most of human history, philosophy wasn't just another subject. It was the discipline from which all others were derived. It was and is a sort of training for the mind itself, teaching people how to question assumptions, weigh arguments, and examine ideas together. In many ways, it is the foundation of education itself. But as schooling has increasingly emphasized content, efficiency, and measurable outcomes, the patient and intricate work of thinking has often been pushed to the margin. My guest today has spent much of his career bringing philosophy back into schools. Peter Worley is the co-founder of the Philosophy Foundation, an organization dedicated to introducing philosophical inquiry into classrooms and public settings. For more than 20 years, Peter has facilitated philosophical conversations with students and trained teachers around the world to guide deeper dialogue. He is the author of 9 books on philosophy and education, questioning, and critical thinking, including the best-selling The If Machine and the widely discussed Corrupting Youth. His work has also inspired the BAFTA-nominated BBC series called What Makes Me Me, the award-winning film Young Plato, and the BBC adaptation of Adam West's memoir about philosophy in prisons called Waiting for the Out. In our conversation, Peter and I explore what philosophy actually looks like when it enters a classroom. We talk about the difference between questions that test knowledge and questions that actually open thinking. Peter explains how philosophical dialogue can change classroom culture by inviting students into genuine intellectual inquiry, where disagreement is not a problem to be solved, but really a resource for deeper understanding. We also discuss why philosophy might be one of the most practical tools we have for educating thoughtful citizens, how teachers can become more intentional in the questions they ask, and why learning to think together may be one of the most important capacities schools can cultivate today. In a time defined by speed, certainty, noise, philosophy reminds us something essential. Thinking well is a practice. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Peter Worley. Good morning, Peter. Where does this podcast find you today?
I am in Weston-super-Mare, in the west of England, sort of near the Bristol part of the world.
Wonderful, wonderful, Peter. Well, I would have given you a proper introduction now, but maybe you can let folks know what keeps you busy these days.
Right. Well, lots of things, because about a year ago I went freelance. So I'm exploring all sorts of new avenues and opportunities, including the usual thing I do, which is working in schools, working with teachers and children in the area of doing philosophy and also thinking and questioning skills. But I'm also looking into new avenues at the moment, such as working with the police on questioning skills as well.
That's interesting. Well, I think you're my third guest, and coincidentally enough, you're all from the UK that's talking about philosophy, but you're the first one to be, having done work in schools, and it's very interesting that you're doing work with police. I'd like to ask you some questions about that. But before we dive into the fascinating work you've been doing for a lifetime, quite frankly, let's start by giving the audience a sense of who you are and where you grew up. Where and when did you grow up, and what was that like?
Well, the reason I'm in Weston-super-Mare is it's not my home. I live in London, southeast London. The reason I'm here is because I'm visiting my parents, who are from this neck of the woods. And it's where I grew up. I grew up in a town just 10 miles or so down the road called Clevedon. So I grew up in this area of the world, the West Country of England. And I had a fairly free range childhood. There was hills, there were cliffs, there was a sea. It's a seaside town, Victorian seaside town. There were places to hide, places to run, places to explore. And for a young kid growing up, that was a really, really great thing, up until I turned into a teenager, when it was a boring place to be, of course. But up until that point, it was the greatest place to be able to live and explore and, but frankly, get in trouble. I mean, I don't know how many times I probably nearly died hanging off a cliff. So quite risky as well, but a great opportunity. And I think that sort of thing, interestingly, does play into the sorts of things that I do and how I approach things.
Do you think some of that kind of risky play is missing in childhood today?
Yes,
Yeah.
I do. Yeah. I mean, obviously, it's a payoff, right? When you take risks, sometimes bad things happen. And for those of us where that doesn't happen, we learn a lot. And we find opportunities that the kids today perhaps wouldn't have had from that approach. But I know that my mother had a kind of struggle with that because she became friendly with somebody who had a very free range approach to parenting. And she was in a more kind of naturally more cautious position. So she tells stories about how when she first started to let us go off and play with these other friends and on this sort of hill, quarry side and so on, she used to sort of go along and hide behind trees to make sure that we were actually safe. So we didn't know. And it was only when she thought, okay, that they seem to be doing things which are okay, that she stopped doing that. And that's something I learned much later.
Yeah. I heard somewhere, and it stuck with me, that the way to do it is to have kids do risky things safely. That's one of the ways to give kids that sense of freedom and exploration and risk taking that is healthy for you. So your mom seemed to be ahead of her time for sure.
Yes, for sure.
So Peter, what really first drew you to philosophy? Like, it sounds like you had an active outdoor life. Philosophy in some ways is the opposite of that, or perceived to be the opposite of that, where you have to sit down and be studious. Did you, like, for example, did you love to read as a child or as an adolescent?
I did. I was an interesting specimen because I was very active, very a doing kind of child and playing a lot out on those hills. But I also loved to read. I loved fantasy and science fiction, and I loved losing myself in worlds in a way that a lot of my friends at the time at school didn't. So I felt somewhat different. They were more interested in football and soccer, what you would call soccer, and stuff like that. And so there was definitely a sort of difference. It was also to do with the kind of school I was at. So yeah, I think that was a difference. And I seem to recall, well, I've forgotten your question now.
But just how you got into philosophy? Was it through reading? I was going to ask
Right.
the follow-up question. Was there a particular novel or work that really captured your interest really young, and
Yeah, absolutely.
created the lifelong love of reading?
Yes. So what it was that got me into philosophy, I think, was first of all being the annoying kid at the back of the class. I was the kid that used to ask the difficult questions, and I used to be annoying. And people would say that I'm still that kid. So I think there was an element of that. I would make the teacher's life a bit difficult by asking those awkward questions. And I think to start with, that was more nihilistic. What I found with philosophy was a place where I could be constructively. I could turn that sort of attitude into something more constructive, and not just sort of cynical or questioning for the sake of it. But in terms of inspirations, I would say it was probably Dungeons and Dragons. Because I remember discovering, first of all, the fighting fantasy game books in my primary school, which really activated me as an engaged reader. And I realized this later, that when I started to write my books, like The If Machine, the first book, I started to notice the structure of the books. I didn't plan this, just noticed it afterwards, was very similar to that of those fighting fantasy game books. I tell stories. I'll tell a story and I'll get to the point where a difficult decision is faced by a character, and I'll stop and say, right, okay, what do you think the character will do? What do you think the character should do? And so on. We then break that down into a philosophical question. What is it to make a choice? Or what is it to be happy, whatever it might be? And we do philosophy like that. And then we come back to the story and say, okay, let's see what happens and see if you agree with what the character does. So what I was doing was activating the classroom as moral agents rather than mere witnesses to a story. So they start to inhabit the questions that the characters are standing inside, and they consider them philosophically before returning, and then they evaluate what the characters have done. And in many ways, you see this in the game of Dungeons and Dragons and the fighting fantasy game books that went before. This sense in which the reader is placed as an agent, someone who in some way determines the direction and the shape of the story and the world in which they stand. And it's not a far step from that to doing philosophy.
Interesting. Dungeons and Dragons is certainly having a cultural moment again. I don't know if it's all of us getting nostalgic about our childhood, but I'd be interested to know if any of that is seeping into kids these days, if they're playing it at all.
Absolutely. As well as running after-school philosophy clubs, I also run after-school Dungeons and Dragons clubs now. A lot of the kids really want to play this game. They know about it. And it's really great to give them an opportunity to play essentially a computer game, but without any computers, in a social context in which we co-create worlds and directions through that. And it's really great to be able to give kids that opportunity. And I tell you, they really respond well to it. They absolutely love doing it.
That's fantastic. Peter, was there ever a teacher that really influenced you to pursue philosophy or to continue to think in the way that that really inspired you?
The teacher that introduced me to those fighting fantasy game books has a lot to answer for. Her name was Jean Lagden, and she was a real inspiration to me when I was 10, 11. And she said to me, come back when you have written your first book. And I did. Actually, I that to her after I'd written about 3 or 4 books, and said to her, here's me just getting back to you to let you know that that I did do that. And also a man called Tim Withers, who taught me in secondary school, same thing, could see my interest in fantasy, and he took me off the curriculum and said, look, you should read this book, Elidor by Alan Garner. Read this. It might inspire you with some of your ideas. And I didn't actually do it. I read that last year, got back in touch with him to say that I'd finished the homework.
that might be a record for the latest turn of an assignment ever.
And the funny thing is, he left the school I was at and taught in other places for many years, and just so happens to have moved back to Clevedon and is now teaching at the Comprehensive there, where he taught me. Sorry, not teaching. He's one of the governors. So funny coincidence that these things happen.
That's great. What was your first contact with formal philosophy? Was it in high school or secondary school?
Well, philosophy came, first of all, I got interested in philosophy because I became interested in religion. I remember being evangelized by some street evangelizers when I would have been about 14. And I got really engaged with them and actually became Christian for a short time in the born-again sense. And I really engaged with it intellectually. And these guys really wanted to engage with me intellectually, which I responded to. But I started to notice there was a difference in the intellectual approach, which I didn't fully understand at the time. And in the end, I discovered philosophy through literature, reading things like, I think probably Henry Miller as a late teen, which led to Dostoevsky, Knut Hamsun, and other writers, which really started to put me in touch with these ideas about, existentialist ideas and questions about life. And that was where it went. It came through literature first in that sense. And then at some point during my studies, I came across this thing called philosophy. And I think I signed up to do a philosophy A-level, which I failed. I failed that A-level, but I absolutely loved what I was engaging with. So I didn't respond to the criteria and exam passing, but I did respond to the books and the ideas that I was presented with. And then later on, returned to philosophy with a determination to do what I needed to get to university, and ended up going to UCL, University College London, to do my degree. And that was when I started to realize that there was a system behind this, or systems and different ways of thinking, that I thought, right now, this is the kind of intellectual tools, approach, culture that speaks to the way I've been trying to, the way in which I've been trying to reason since I was at school. This kind of logical and in some ways systematic, evaluativist approach.
I think a lot of American capitalism would be tamed if folks read Death of a Salesman, because you can certainly tell that the vast majority of these tech bros have not, or at least have not understood it. So that's we have a similar background on how we got into philosophy. So then you formally studied philosophy in university. Take me to a short time after that. Did you work as a teacher professionally, or did you have another career before you founded the Philosophy Foundation?
Right. So I started actually as a guitar teacher. So I started teaching guitar. I think started to blag my way into teaching guitar when I was about 15, 16, when I'd only been playing for a year or so. But I went on to study formally music college, and went on to become professional guitar teacher and guitarist, playing in bands and stuff. And I did that for a number of years, and had this interest in philosophy as a kind of what I saw as a separate thing, two different things. But then I started as a teacher. The point at which I saw the connection was when I studied the Meno by Socrates at university, in which Socrates is exploring learning and what it is to learn. And I started to think I could see a way in which his demonstration with the slave boy, where he's attempting to demonstrate something through questioning alone. And he's also trying to demonstrate how learning occurs and can occur with questioning alone. Now, he has a whole theory about recollection and the soul, which we'll put to one side for one moment, because what I got from it as a practitioner was, I wonder if I can question more rather than tell, instruct. I wonder if I can do that. So I started to use this principle, actually, first of all, in my guitar teaching, where I start to think about my questioning and using that Socratic principle of teaching new knowledge from known knowledge. If you know this note, and you don't know that note, what questions do I ask to get you to it? So is this note higher or lower? Do you know the scale? Yes. How many notes away from it in the scale is it? And so on. So eventually the child is able to say it's an E rather than me just saying it's an E. So that was where I started to sort of use those, in many ways, pedagogical principles. And I think this is the interesting thing for me, is that I straddle an interesting place academically and as a practitioner in that, well, am I a philosopher or a pedagogue? Am I studying philosophy or am I thinking about the pedagogy, the teaching, the questioning? And I've noticed that there's an interesting relationship between these two, so that it's difficult for me to find a department to do a PhD in.
And so then take me to the founding of the Philosophy Foundation that, certainly I can let you describe it, but advocated for philosophy with children and in primary schools. What inspired you to set up that foundation, and can you describe what that work was like?
Well, I was working as a guitar teacher in a school. I was also doing an MA in philosophy at the time, having wanted to take my studies further. And the reason I wanted to take my studies further is I'd begun training as a philosophical counselor with Tim Le Bon. He was the sort of leading guy on this in the UK at the time, and he ran an excellent course and training program. So I did that. And I thought, well, in order to do this, I need to further my philosophy studies. And so there were these three things in place at the time: academic interest, counseling, philosophical counseling, and the teaching of music. And I said to my head teacher at the school, I said, do you know what? I'm quite interested to do something like philosophy with these children in the same way that I do music. Because what I'd noticed was that if I have a group of 4 or 5 kids, which I usually had when I taught a lesson of guitar, then they would turn up and I'd have one child who was brand new, couldn't do anything, one who could play a few open strings, and maybe another one who could play some scales, quite widely. And I used to have to try and arrange pieces for them so that they could all play at their own level. But I would find a way to do something like Nirvana's Teen Spirit for the whole, assembly and parents, where these kids were just doing simple things that they could each do, and more advanced things for the more advanced players, but the overall effect was great. So I called this the ensemble effect, where the part where the sum is greater than, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And I wondered whether philosophy might work in a similar way, because doing philosophy, and I found that this is the case, doing philosophy with one child, unless they're brilliant and exceptional in some way, is really hard to do, because they just don't have the variety of ideas and diversity of ideas to be able to carry it forward without you, the facilitator, doing a lot of work for them. Whereas if you have a group of children, and I work with whole classes, so I'm talking 30 children, then actually whatever question is raised, whatever comes up, there's always someone who's got something more to say, a divergent idea which takes things in a new direction or challenges what's just been said. And so that ensemble effect really shines through in that when I work with a group of children from 8 upwards, as in a number 8, number of people upwards, then we can do the philosophy in a way that resembles real philosophy, where I'm not doing all the work for them. So that was what I noticed. And that teacher gave me the opportunity to try it out and to play around with that. And it was only after that I found other approaches, started to read and research other approaches, and sort of thought to myself, I'm not quite sure if I'm happy with these other approaches in the full sense. It's not quite doing what I would see philosophy doing and what I think children are actually capable of in terms of doing philosophy. So I've always had this attitude that we bring the children up to philosophy rather than the philosophy down to the children. And that's been the way that I've approached it. And as a result, me and my ex-wife set up Emma Swin set up the Philosophy Foundation. First of all, it was the Philosophy Shop, which was a community interest company. We turned into a foundation charity a few years later. So I started doing this in the early 2000s. We set up the Philosophy Shop about 2007. and then it became a charity in 2010.
What are some of the biggest misconceptions people have about a young person's capacity, child's capacity for philosophical thinking?
Oh, I think the biggest misconception is that they don't think they can do it. More specifically, they don't think they can abstract well enough. This is what Matthew Lippmann said about very young children. He thought that they, not Lippmann, Piaget said, Piaget said this. They can't reason from a very young age because they can't abstract, and they can only really abstract when they're in their teens. Well, this is not true. And the other thing that I often find people get confused about is the sort of mistaking, as Piaget did, mistaking stage with age. So, yes, it's true that if I work with young children, there are many that can't abstract, but there are some that can. And the ones that can role model abstract thinking to those that can't. And it starts to sort of spread in practice by doing that. And within a year, I see a whole bunch of new kids that can abstract that couldn't before. And a few years down the line, the whole class is able to do it before they're even out of primary school. So, and to what extent they're learning from each other, to what extent this is just innate development, and to what extent it's a mixture of the two, which I suspect it is difficult to say or measure. But nevertheless, I see abstraction happening at different levels. I also notice that, interestingly, from my experience, and this is purely anecdotal, but I noticed that before the age of sort of 10 to 12, they're really willing and able to enter into any kind of conversation, however abstract or pointless, in inverted commas, it might be. So discussing whether I think the example that A.C. Grayling gave you the other day when you interviewed him was an example from one of our from our practice, was the one about the donut and whether or not a hole is part of the donut. Well, this is, when you actually get into what a hole is, it's pretty abstract. And the children are very capable of doing that. It's only when they sort of reach the age of somewhere between sort of 12 and 14, they start saying, oh, what's the point of this? So interestingly, they start to question the point of it for a variety of reasons. I don't exactly know what they are, but I suspect it's something to do with how education has become very test-orientated, very goal-orientated, exam-orientated by then. But it could be other things as well, stuff which is going on in their own heads as well. So there's definitely a kind of sense in which, to some extent, working with primary, you can go deeper and more and wider, certainly, with the philosophical inquiry that you might not be able to do with the older ones. So in that sense, there's sometimes a bit of a backward step.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Can you, obviously there's a lot of educators and senior leaders in school districts that listen to this podcast. Can you give them a sense of what this looks like in practice? Like, and maybe I can cue you here to one that I found particularly interesting that I actually just came across this morning. I saw a teacher on LinkedIn tag you for giving them a great lesson around questioning, which started with a teacher taping up a box so it's closed, putting it in the center of the classroom, and asking kids what's in the box and how can we figure out what's in the box. Do you have any other examples you can share or talk about?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've got hundreds of them. But I think and that, by the way, is called the hypothesis box, and it's in the book 40 Lessons to Get Children Thinking, which is a Bloomsbury book. Which is designed to have them think about what a hypothesis is. And it also shows the point at which philosophy and science meet. Because when they're saying, if you ask them, if the hypothesis is there's an object in the box, then you ask them how you're going to find out. And the idea is to ask them without them opening it. And the moment at which they say, well, you just have to open it, right? Well, and then you ask them, you ask them a technique I would call ifing, where I say, okay, so if we were to open it, what might be fine? Well, they say, well, if we see something in there, then there's an object in there. And I say, and if we don't see something in there, what would that mean? And they'll say, well, and then some of them will say, that would mean there's no object in there. But the moment they say that, hands go up. Someone says, there might be an object we can't see. Okay, and then you go into that. And it's not very far into it before you realize that you have to say what you mean by object. And of course, this is any hypothesis, you have to at some point say what you mean by the key concept words and object words and so on in the hypothesis. So at this point, you start to realize that there is some conceptual analysis that needs to be done by a scientist when they're thinking about what they're actually measuring and how they would decide criteria for that. So it's a nice example of that. But the key thing, I think, that we could say about all the sessions is that they are designed to create some kind of response to something that we can then, as facilitators, exploit in order to make good philosophical and dialectical discussion. So the idea is, I suppose the key thing I'm doing is I'm presenting them with a question. I put that in inverted commas because when I say question, I just mean kind of puzzle or problem. It doesn't have to be formulated as a grammatical question, but it has to be seen by them as something that in some way needs to be resolved. So whether I tell a story from the Odyssey, I present a box on the floor, or simply ask a grammatical question like, is my phone clever? I'm creating something which creates a response. And I do this by using particular techniques. So I ask what I call a grammatically closed but conceptually open question. Is my phone clever? Is the mind the same as the brain? This requires a yes-no response, but it also requires a lot more. And we start to understand what that is only when we understand that distinction between the conceptually open and closed questions and grammatically open and closed questions, also empirically open and closed questions, and there are others. But it's the conceptual and grammatical that I focus on for my practice. So if I ask a question like that, what it does is it elicits an intuitive response, which is pre-reflective, which kind of comes from the gut. Is my phone clever? You will have a thought about that. It'll be something like yes, no, sort of, maybe, I'm not sure. Or it'll be yes, hang on, no. Mm-hmm. It's triggering what's called a dialectical effect because it elicits a simple intuitive response, which is inclusive because almost everyone in the class has that. It's pre-reflective. So it means that actually in philosophy, the first rule of Philosophy Club is don't think. Say the first thing that comes into your head. Philosophy begins with our intuitions. And it also continues with the co-presence of intuitions and conflict. And the conflict comes in a philosopher, of course. They do both. They have the yes and the no in their head. But in a classroom, only a few will have that, but many of them will have a yes, and many of them will have a no. And that's where the conflict is. So what we're doing is we're kind of externalizing the philosophical process into a group of children rather than in one philosopher. But they model how to do it as one philosopher. So they all start to learn this process of problem seeing and seeing things from different points of view. Because children tend to be one-eyed thinkers. They say what they think, and it's just that. But the class of children is essentially potentially a 30-eyed thinking monster. So they start to see that there are lots of different perspectives. So we create that, the question, all the different yeses, nos, maybes, and so on that are in response to that kind of question. I can then simply open them up. Can you say why you think yes? Can you say why you think no? Can you say what you mean by? Can you say a little bit more about that? And the technique is purely structural. My questioning is designed to elicit more using the structures of their thought. So if they say yes, why do you think? Can you say why you think yes? If they say, I'm not sure, or I'm confused, I say, can you say why you're confused? So I avoid interpreting, paraphrasing. I avoid telling them what they should think or where they could go. And I simply provide responsive structures and then open up those structures to create something like a more considered and elaborate response. And if you put my questions all next to each other, you end up with them saying why they think yes, why they think what they mean by, and what the difference between X and Y is. These are the questions I've asked them and they're able to articulate. So it's a structural role that I'm playing and a responsive starting point, which I'm then through structures able to develop. I think that's essentially what I'm doing there.
So I want to get into how you work with teachers to help them structure this process in their classrooms. But before we get there, do you have any memorable philosophical discussions that you've witnessed in the classroom that stand out that you could share with the audience?
Oh gosh, yes. I mean, there are many. I was having one recently with some slightly older children, sort of 12 to 16-year-olds, in which they were thinking about the conditions for knowledge. Trying to get them to come up with conditions for knowledge. What is it we need to be able to say that we know something? And they started to structure on their own. They started to suggest that what we need is reasons and evidence, and then we come to our conclusion. And others said, no, what we need is start with the conclusion and then look for the reasons and evidence. And I remember what was striking about this was that they started to realize that even though you can sometimes be wrong when you're looking for evidence and stuff first and then drawing a conclusion, they thought that on the whole that it would be more reliable than doing it the other way around. So they saw that subtle difference between a exhaustive, necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge. They could see that that was not satisfactory, but they could also see that it gives you more reliable results than reasoning from conclusions to premises. And I think this is really insightful. I mean, I know very few grown-ups who are aware of that subtlety themselves. So this is the sort of thing that I'm hearing regularly. And last week there was a session with the Odyssey where we're talking about choice. What is a choice? Odysseus has to make a choice. He's either got to go back and get his men and turn them back from being made into pigs, or he's got to run away and leave them, as one of his crew members is recommending they do. And he says to him, I have no choice. I have to go back. And we use this as an opportunity to discuss what a choice is. And these children drew models of choices. I asked them to draw them. Could you illustrate that? And then they all wanted to do it. So we ended up with all these different diagrams. There must have been about 6 or 7 different kinds of diagram representing different kinds of choice. The teachers were blown away because this was way beyond their own understanding. And they said that, I've never thought of choice in this kind of way. I've always just thought of it as a sort of Y-shaped thing. And we had all these different ones. And there was one wonderful moment where a boy said, well, we're making choices every second. I'm making a choice because I'm not going out of the room right now and I'm listening to you. These are all choices. And this girl sat next to him just went, oh yeah. I witnessed insight. And I said to her, oh, why did you go, And she went, because I get it now. Because of what he said, I get it. There's not just one choice, but then that turns into more choices, lots of them. Then you make another choice. That turns into lots of choices. And she said, so it's an infinite series of choices. Choices are infinite. And each choice is a question. I thought that was beautiful. Wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I have this phrase that when we ask a question that matters to us, that actually impacts on our lives, right? So it has an existential dimension to it. I say that we are standing inside a question. Now, that's a phrase I've used for a while to describe that kind of question, when it actually impacts on you, matters. But I thought this was a beautiful way of actually describing that, showing how the notion of choice has some sort of relationship with the nature of questioning in this way. And this girl would have been 10 years old.
Wonderful. So you mentioned teachers also experiencing something new when being witness to your methods and to what the students are actually capable of unpacking. How do you coach and how do you work with teachers?
Oh, it's tricky because I never have enough time to do anything properly with them for one reason or another, lack of funding or whatever it might be. So I tend to just use, practically speaking, I mean, I do training days and I do that, and I'll take them through these kinds of techniques and strategies. But what I'm often doing is just taking a moment to step aside from the session while the children are talking with each other and saying to the teacher, what I just did was, or what did you think of that? And engaging them. So either I'm engaging them with the idea and they're telling me what they think about how the children have responded and so on, or I'm showing them a technique, a strategy that I've used. You know, I just used the opening up that works like this, or I've just used this technique or that technique, and they'll respond. So that's what I'm often doing, is just, and I think it's the best time to grab them actually is when they witness something. It's just happened and they've seen the impact. When I go and say to them, right, this is what I did.
And do you think like having a course in like almost a teacher prep course in questioning would be useful for them early in their teaching career?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. And of course I would say that, wouldn't I? Because I train people in questioning. But no, of course, I think, I mean, when you think of how central questioning is to teaching and how often they're doing it, you've got to ask yourself, surely there could be a more efficient way of doing that. And the questioning is so central. It's like chopping for a chef.
Yeah. So like, yeah. So like, if you can give the teachers listening some advice or some tips on how to cultivate a classroom culture that's centered around questioning, what would you suggest to them? Where can they begin? Obviously, they can pick up one of your books, and I highly recommend that. Yes. But where should they start?
The way I put it is that you can have really good questioning skills and still fail to run a good discussion. And you can have quite poor questioning skills and be really successful at running a good discussion. And I think the reason for this is the mindset. So I describe something called an open questioning mindset, and also it's the closed questioning mindset, OQM. And this is what I do a lot of my training in when I work with teachers. And to put it very simply, it's the kind of dynamic between you and the children in terms of your mindset. So probably the easiest way to put it is a closed questioning mindset is when you ask a question, kind of knowing what you want from the answer. You already know what the answer is, perhaps, or you know which answer you're looking for. And the children are simply trying to work out what it is they're supposed to say. That's a closed questioning mindset, and it's one that we find ourselves in a lot. It's the guess what's in my head questioning and teaching, which is sometimes known as. But it's also about, and the open questioning mindset is when you ask a question and you only expect them to say what it is they are going to say or is in their head. Right, wrong, whatever. You simply say, tell me what you think, and I want to know what you think, not what I want you to think or what you think I want you to think, which is even, because that's the problem. Even when you stop being in a closed mindset, doesn't necessarily mean that they've stopped. They might still think, that they've got to find something, even if you don't want them to. So you have to find a way of communicating to them that you're only looking for. And in my experience, it's usually very simple. When you ask a question and they answer, if they're in a closed questioning mindset, they'll often say, is it, at the beginning. You ask a question, they go, is it a square? Is it this? And that immediately tells you that they're in a closed questioning mindset. Whereas if you get the right mindset across as a culture, then that stops. And they simply say what they think. And then you can deal with it. But this also goes another way as well, and that's to do with guess what's in your head. So the closed questioning mindset is also when I'm telling you what you're thinking. So what you're saying is, so what you mean is this. And when you do that, and children sometimes struggle to say what they mean and very often a teacher will step in and say, do you mean this? Offering them a lifeline. And very often it's not what they mean, but they'll say, yeah, that's it. Because the teacher's basically just given them a good answer that they can grab hold of. So the closed questioning mindset works in those two ways. It's the guess what's in my head, and it's the I'm guessing what's in your head, constructing thoughts and arguments for you on your behalf. And the open questioning mindset asks us to stop doing that so much. Not necessarily entirely, but so much. So that we say, okay, what questions can I ask to get them to say what they actually think, rather than me telling them what they think? And what questions can I ask to get them to explore this and maybe even answer the question for themselves? Going back to the Socratic principles I used with my guitar students right at the beginning of my career.
So if I can ask you to reflect on what education systems might need to change if they really wanted to, and we really wanted to value deep thinking, dialogue, questioning as educational outcomes, what would be some of the changes you'd suggest?
Okay. So I think a few points here which I've noted down, which I think are important. One is a shift towards the qualitative over the quantitative. Thinking about the quality of answers and engagement rather than just measurable. Of course, this is harder to do. I realize that everything I'm saying is logistically problematic, but let's just put that all to one side. But not instead of, but on top of. So we still consider the quantitative, of course, but we put a bit more of an emphasis on the qualitative. I also think a descriptive approach to assessment and teaching is what's needed. And by this, I make a distinction between descriptive and prescriptive teaching. Prescriptive is where you say, right, this is what you're not doing, this is what you're supposed to do, and here are some slides, this is it, and here are some examples, now have a go. And I think a lot of teaching is done like that. Descriptive teaching is, I'm going to teach you counterexamples. Why? Because she just did one over here. She used a counterexample when she said that when you said all birds fly, and she said, no, they don't, because a penguin is a bird, but it doesn't fly. It's a counterexample. So we're now going to teach you what counterexamples are because of the fact that it's just been used. And then next week, when someone else uses it again, I'll say, we just got another counterexample. Can anyone spot who it was? And so on. So you teach descriptively because you teach what they do, what they're doing, so it becomes more metacognitive. So rather than just intuitive, they actually know what it is they're doing and they can use it more deliberatively. So I think that descriptive approach to assessment could work really well. Not, right, these are the 5 things we're looking for and which children did them. More of, right, let's just watch them all interact and do things and solve a problem, and we can say that this boy did a really good job of doing this. So I'm simply saying what it is they did that was good, rather than looking for those who can actually match the thing we're looking for, which again is more open question mindset, you'll notice, than closed questioning mindset, as I described it earlier. I would also say that we need a balance. We need to balance teacher training with children's learning. It's all very well, at the moment we have a problem in that every teacher thinks that children should be taught critical thinking, but no teacher is taught critical thinking to know well enough what it is and to know how to teach it. So on those occasions when critical thinking is taught in classrooms, it's usually taught poorly, not because the teachers are bad at it intrinsically, just because they're not ever trained in it properly. They don't understand it as an evaluativist project, which means where we use critical thinking to evaluate claims and to be able to decide, which claims can be rejected and so on. Very often critical thinking is just seen as an opportunity to talk, say what we think, and share our ideas. But of course, that's not critical thinking. So I always think that we need to balance teacher training with children's learning so that it works both ways. And teaching just needs to be more dialogic. So these are the things, but the evaluativist thing is very important, and there's not enough of that in education. And if you read the wonderful paper by Kuhn and Dean, 2004, I think it was, they describe the stages of epistemological development in children. Absolutist, realist, I think it's that way around. And then what's the third one? Yeah. Multiplist. And then finally, evaluativist. So it starts with children just think what they see and experience is true. Then they move to, I can be wrong, but the teacher will tell me. So absolutist to realist, I think. And then finally, I might have got that the wrong way around, but you know what I mean. Then you get to multiplist, when everything's just a matter of opinion. Children get to this are usually around their teens. They just fall into it naturally. And as Kuhn and Dean say, they don't get out of it easily. They stay there unless someone helps them out of the well of multiplist thinking, as they describe it. And the problem is that it's also the case that quite a lot of teachers are also in the multiplist well. So they're not in a position to help them out because they've not been properly taught evaluativist tools where claims are not just of a matter of opinion, but can be subject to criteria of truth value and analysis of that kind of analysis. So we can see when a statement actually makes sense. And one of the things I'm always talking about is don't say to people that there's no right and wrong in philosophy, because it's absolutely not true. Virtually everything somebody says can be assessed as right or wrong as a basic inference. So almost anyone someone says usually can be structured as, I think, therefore. And most children, the critical thinking I hear most common in the classroom is just because doesn't mean that. And what they're doing is that they're challenging the inferences that their peers have made. And very often they'll be right. Nice example, if you want me to give one, would be when I asked them, so what is real? What do we mean by real? Someone said, something is real if it's in the world. And someone said, well, what about planets? They're not in the world, and they're real. So that's a counterexample. And they have refuted the claim. They've shown it to be wrong, that if something is real, it's got to be in the world. So on one level, that is happening all the time. Those are evaluativist tools for refuting or evaluating a claim. Interestingly, though, the effect was that the child said, I didn't mean the world as in the earth. I meant the world as in the universe. Now, once that qualification had been made, it was a better statement. It now made better sense. What we see there is the way in which critical thinking as an evaluativist tool not only challenges, but helps each of the children improve their thinking. And so it's not just deconstruct, we shouldn't just see it as a sort of negative project where everyone's wrong. It becomes a tool. These tools become the tool with which we make better, clearer, more accurate, and closer to true statements than we start with. And that's the classic Socratic project seen as a positive thing rather than a negative.
Wonderful. If education policy makers are listening to this, what would you suggest as the single most important change they can make to support philosophical inquiry across schools?
I think probably Socratic questions. Socratic questioning. And by this what I mean is Socrates is well known for saying, right, think for yourself, essentially, and asking people to think for themselves. But I would say that what we want to do is create something metacognitive so that we learn to be a Socrates to ourselves. And I'd like to extend that to AI and say that we need to include the AI in the way we do this. So we want to be a Socrates to our I self. Because the way we can use AI is we can use it as a mirror where we simply reflect my own views, a bit like an echo chamber. And I've seen, this is how it works. The AI is kind of programmed to reflect back your position. So, it only challenges you if you ask it to, and it will only take other positions if you ask it to, but it will tend to mirror back your views. So what we need to do is to be taught how to use the AI so that it does challenge us, so that it does broaden our view, so that it represents our opponent's idea to us as a legitimate position, rather than just as a straw man. And if we can start to learn those tools, learn how to, then we can get past what my partner and I call the veil of artificial intent of ignorance. Veil of artificial ignorance. That's it. Because we can really use these tools to expand and get us to be more reflective, critical, or we can use them to simply stand in front of the mirror and have it all say the same things back to me that I'm saying into it. And that's all to do with the prompts, which is all to do with the question. So it comes back to questioning. So that's why I say Socratic questioning is key. But one other thing I'd want to say is one thing I've noticed in my daughter, who's only 15 and is going through the education system. And one of the things that I've noticed is the difference between conceptual and procedural. And I think a lot of the teaching is focused on the procedural. This is the steps you need to follow to answer these questions. This is the procedure you need to know to be able to do this. But nice story. My daughter said to me one day, "Can you help me with this maths homework?" And I said, "Oh, I can't do maths really. You ask your granddad. It's my dad. He's a maths teacher." And she said, "Oh, can you just come and help me?" So I came to look. I looked at it and it was fractions. And it's a long time since I've done all this stuff. So in other words, the procedural stuff was out of my head. I can't remember all the procedures for long division and so on, and fractions and so on. But I looked at it and I was able to say, well, it's multiple choice, right? So I looked at it and said to her, right, okay, what have we got to do? Blah, blah, blah. But I had a conceptual understanding of what fractions are. I know that they are relations of parts and wholes, and I know how that kind of works in a conceptual, broad sense. So I was able to look at the things, take a series of questions to myself and to her, and then I said, I think it might be this one. Let's see. And she put it in. She said it was right. She said, how did you do that? How did you know that? You said you don't remember all this stuff. So I tried to explain to her that difference, the difference between the procedural and the conceptual, which essentially means that I'm estimating, but in a multiple choice, of course, estimation can give you the right answer. Now, interestingly, what I think we get from this is that we need to put more emphasis on the conceptual understanding of what it is that we're doing, rather than the procedural aspect. And more over and over again, that seems to me to be the shortcoming of people who are going through the current education system in the UK anyway. I can't speak for other systems. So that's another key thing which I'd want to highlight.
So Peter, my penultimate question for you is, what is a big question that you think everyone, not just students or teachers, should be asking themselves today?
How can I do whatever it is I'm doing better? I think that. Because learning is one thing. I learn how to do something. Teach me how to do this. Teach me how to do that. But it's only when I say, right, I've learned that now. How can I do it better? That I become metacognitive. I think this is the shift where we become metacognitive learners, when we actively say, how can I do this better? What is it I've just done? How did I do it? And how can I do it better? So I'd say that's probably the simplest question I can come up with for what we should ask ourselves is, apart from how can I do something, take that as read, then we go to how can I do something better?
And my final question is always, what book, movie, podcast, music album would you recommend to the audience? It can be multiple. You don't have to pick just one.
Well, I've just seen the film The Life of Chuck, which I read this short story by Stephen King first, and then thought, I need to see this. So I watched it with my family the other night. I thought it was one of the best films I've ever seen. Because of the way in which it addresses the existential questions. Have you seen the film?
No, I haven't actually.
Well, in which case you should, and so should everyone else. Yeah, this is a film about knowledge, about storytelling, about life and the things which matter in our lives, the small things as well that matter, where value comes from. And it's also a film about how we as a species, I think, have the capacity for seeing our death. So one of the things we gained was we can foresee, we can plan, we can see into the future, we can predict things in ways that we couldn't when many thousands of years ago. And the downside to that was that we see our own death. And we have to deal with that, and psychologically in all sorts of ways. And I think there are religious ways of doing that, and there are other ways. And I think that the life of Chug is one answer to that question.
Wonderful way to wrap this up. Peter Worley, thank you for your time.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been wonderful.
This podcast is recorded on the territory and Treaty 13 lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The show is edited and produced by the marvelous and talented Andrew Mastroianni. If you like what you're hearing, make sure you subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. Until next time, remember, there's absolutely no inevitability as long as there's a willingness to contemplate what's happening. I'm your host, Jason Buccheri. Until next time.